Bueno, pues buenas tardes. Vamos a dejar que estamos de vuelta a la comida entonces. Pero bueno, este es el plato fuerte, ¿no? Y me da muchísimo gusto, por supuesto, recibir a Branco Milanovic aquí. Y me da doble gusto recibirlo en el marco del 9º Congreso de SobreMéxico. Creo que la sociedad, Isidro, ha sido exitosa en estos años con el SEI. Hemos tenido presentadores de nivel máximo. El año pasado estuvo aquí Miles Korak y ahora estás tú. Y no voy a detener en una presentación de Branco, no necesita presentación, simplemente comentar que, como la gran mayoría de ustedes saben, ya hace una semana, un poco más de una semana, se lanzó su último libro, Visiones de la Desigualdad. Ya está disponible, ya lo pueden comprar, ya lo pueden leer, y tenemos la gran oportunidad de escuchar de viva voz del autor que nos cuente, ¿no?, sobre este libro. Entonces, te agradezco muchísimo, Branco. La presentación va a ser en inglés, pero Branco me entiende perfectamente el español. Pero también las preguntas sí les vamos a pedir que sean en inglés en la medida de lo posible, ¿sí? Branco me comentó que va a hablar unos 20-25 minutos, esperando que después de eso pueda haber un intercambio con el público. Entonces, muchísimas gracias. Bienvenido, Branco.
Muchísimas gracias para la invitación y para la introducción. Hablo español, pero no perfectamente, pero puedo lo entender. Y por favor, si quieren preguntar al final de la presentación, pueden hacerlo en español. Pero en total pienso que ustedes inglés es mejor que mi español. Y para esta razón, la presentación será en inglés. This is a new book, as Roberto said. It was just published a week ago. It's a book about economic history, but from a very specific angle. And that angle is angle of income distribution of inequality. Now, I could go and explain in a long time that it was actually not very easy to sort of translate classical authors into the language which we use today. So I was not always translating, but I was actually essentially trying, as I say in the introduction of the book, to ask the following question from each of them. I'll tell you who are the 6 authors. The question is like, if you had an essay question of a student and you say, what do you think are the forces that determine income distribution at your time then, and how would that income distribution evolve? And the authors that I study in the book are François Quesnay, who is, I think many people believe that he was founder of political economy. Let me just see if we can move this. He's not actually here, this is like previous slides. So, but he's in the book, the chapter 1. And the next, of course, the next 3 are very sort of obvious choices. It's Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Karl Marx. So basically classical authors. Then I have, this is, as I said, not everybody who is here is in the book as well. I was just giving sort of evolution of income distribution studies. You know, you have then a period where really methodology becomes much more important. That's not part of the book. Then you have part where really the empirics become much more important, which is in the very end of the book and somewhat critically discussed. And then, of course, you have the more recent period where we have people like Atkinson and Piketty. Piketty is in the epilogue, but I really wanted to finish with the end of the Cold War. So the book really covers 200 years. Actually, conveniently enough, it starts with a, I don't know what's wrong here. Okay, I conveniently enough starts with basically Quesnay before the French Revolution, before 1789, and ends with the fall of the technically, and with the fall of communism and the Berlin Wall in 1989. So it's really 200 years. Now, when you look at all these people, and I will not have the time to speak of all of them. I really want to focus on classical authors today. But when you look at them, what you notice, like in a movie camera, is that you notice that the income distribution that they have in mind that changes, actually the actors, the cleavages. With Keynote, who works in the French pre-revolutionary time, really the social classes are legally defined. And actually I could really speak more of Keynote because I find him extremely interesting, but just notice that there are three top classes that are legally defined. This is clergy, aristocracy, and government. So that's how, and then there are other classes like tenant farmers, landlords, workers in the guilds, or the owners, I mean, employers. So, but the class structure is really essentially driven by legal definitions of classes. Then you move to the three classical authors, Smith, Ricardo, and Marx. And as you know, the class there becomes really defined by the access to the means of production, whether you have land or you have a capital, or you have just simply your labor power. Then you have Pareto, who is my author number 5, where actually for the first time, the income distribution becomes an interpersonal matter. It's no longer classes, it's really individuals. And in Pareto's view, as you know, he was a sociologist. He, of course, is one of those people who believed, and maybe rightly when we see it now, in the circulation of the elites. And then really that becomes the elite versus everybody else. And then I come to Kuznets, who is like the sixth and the last author, who actually then divides the population essentially into the agricultural versus urban, manufacturing versus agriculture. So rural versus urban, manufacturing versus agriculture. So, but they are all individuals, and it's the antechamber to my last chapter, which then discusses what happened during the period between 1960 and 1990, where for many reasons, I can list three of them, we had in the West essentially a total elimination of class analysis, elimination of elite analysis, and a focus of individuals who actually just simply happen to have different assets. And these assets themselves could be like non-differentiated, as actually, for example, Sam Bowles mentioned in the presentation that Luis was there, is that you write a production function with a limited number of assets, no longer capital and labor. You can have like assets that are called A, B, C, D, and so on. So the basic feature which existed in classical authors between owners of the means of production and people who get income without work, and people who don't have access to the means of production and get income only if they work, and if they work under the control of the people who have capital, that distinction totally disappears. And I will not go and speak about that, but I think actually for many people it would be interesting to read that chapter because it's the most critical chapter in the book. In the rest, I actually try as much as I can to be sympathetic or emphatic, to have empathy with the authors and to explain what I believe is their point of view. So I would like to spend more time on Smith and Marx. I'm not sure how. Okay, what I want the chapter on Smith really takes the point of view, which is quite sort of general, is to look at the theory of moral sentiments and the wealth of nations. As you know, Smith was not an extremely prolific author, and whatever lots of that stuff that he wrote, including his correspondence, as you might know, he burned before he died. So he made sure that when he was dying, that people would burn his manuscripts in front of him. He was not like Kafka, who left it for Max Brod. We have really two big books, and we have the lectures on jurisprudence that were taken by the students. These are students' notes. Now, the theory of moral sentiments against wealth of nations has been, of course, discussed quite a lot. I think we are being under influence of Amartya Sen and many others, and myself, I've been under the influence of Amartya, in the sense that there was this belief that theory of moral sentiments, which is based on essential principle of empathy, is much more leftist and nicer, and the wealth of nations, which is based on the principle of self-interest, somehow is tough and harsh. And I don't think it is wrong, but when you come on a discussion of political issues, theory of moral sentiments is essentially written by a moral philosopher, sort of religious, you know, he was either agnostic or religious, but in other words, it has a certain religious feel to it, and an implication, which sometimes really is rather obvious and sometimes even silly, that the order of things that exist in this world here is natural, and that the rich, of course, can be criticized for frivolity, for lack of education, for the way that they behave, but the justice of their position is never questioned. And it reminded me, of course, with the author that we all know for many years later. I'm now, okay, let me just move to, if I can get to Smith, actually. Okay, yeah, well, sorry. Reminding, for example, of Veblen-like critiques, which are fun to read, but really they are not very deep critiques. And theory of moral sentiments, as I said, is not a critique of the social order, nor of the way that the rich have acquired their wealth. It is a critique of behavior of the rich and frivolity. And moreover, since it tries to present the social order as basically immutable, gives statements whereby, for example, there is a statement, I think it was quoted somewhere even here, is that the division of land is immaterial, because even if this land is owned by one person and 10 others have nothing, that one person has actually to purchase goods that he needs and the services. So Adam Smith really somewhat incredibly says that it really doesn't matter, because these people who don't have land have still the same income, even if as if they had land, because they have to provide work for the rich guy. I mean, it's just mind-boggling, because it makes obviously no sense, because clearly there is a difference in income between a person who has the income from land and others who are actually working in order to get this income. Because at the extremis, you could actually argue that maybe the entire wealth should be in the hands of 5 people, because they would have to hire others. So that's actually a very unusual statement for Adam Smith, who is actually always very precise and very sort of hard, I mean, obviously very clever and intelligent. Now, the wealth of nations, in my opinion, is much more leftist, and that was actually because it is the stern realism of the really existing capitalism. And I use that word actually intentionally, the term. It was really existing capitalism where the rich people, and particularly the employers, and I'll come to that maybe in a minute, are criticized for the way they have acquired wealth and for their attempt to exercise political power. And that, I think, is quite important, because when he goes through the ways that the rich have become rich, they are really the very striking quotes, if I can just not skip them. Of course, there is the use of irony, which is, precisely because it's so realistic, it is critical and ironic also at the same time. Now, a criticism is the monopoly, collusion, plunder, invasions, colonialism, all the ways that the rich have become rich. It's what Marx later would call the primitive accumulation of capital. It's actually striking, and I intentionally put it in the book in such a way that, let me see if I can get this, that the quotes follow each other like sort of bullets, like a machine gun, if you will, because the critique is so strong when you put it together, although it comes from different parts of the wealth of nations, that you're actually struck. It's not a critique, it's a really critique that would be very much, as I said in the book, it's like, it's stronger than what Bernie Sanders says in the US. It's actually very much on the left. and very realistic. Now, people who are not criticized in the book are really workers, and they're not criticized because they do not have either capital or political influence. So really, they're criticized for not being educated and maybe lazy, but there is no sort of visceral critique as the one that is used against the employers. So I really find it very interesting how the wealth of nations was really hijacked, because it is true that the quotes that he's also very critical of the government, because governments are also using the power for their own empowerment. So these quotes are always quoted, and they are true. They are quotes from Adam Smith, and they are not wrong quotes, but they are just they represent a specific choice that really disregards all the other points in the wealth of nations. And then when we come to income inequality, there are, of course, three classes: landlords, employers. He doesn't use the word capitalist because the word was not still used, because it was a commercial society at the time, and workers. Now, when he talks about the evolution of their shares, or actually of their incomes, he says the following. He says, essentially, as societies develop, the wages would go up, and he uses the example of more advanced societies. In those days, the Netherlands was the richest, and actually he then lists the societies by the level of income and wages. And actually, important point, he believes that the worth of the success of a society is reflected in how well is the largest class in that society, meaning working class, doing. So it's really interesting, a big change compared to the mercantilists. Now it's really the most numerous class whose welfare is the objective of policies. So wages would go up as societies become more advanced. Rents of landlords would also go up, because Adam Smith says that there will be increased demand for products of the earth, whether it be mining or, for example, other things like, cotton, food, and so forth. So the rents and wages go up. So that's very important. What happens to the profits? And that's interesting. And then, of course, will be taken in different versions by Ricardo and Marx. Profits, he says, would tend to go down with the advance of society, because there will be more capital, and more capital will compete. That's his explanation. There is no marginalism in capitalism, like marginal product of capital being less. There will be simply greater competition. Again, he uses the Netherlands, and very positively saying Netherlands is the country with high wages and low rate of interest, and implicitly low rate of profit. And that's the society towards which, of course, development tends to go. And very interestingly, there is a sentence where he said the low rate of interest is a reflection of more advanced society, plus it does not allow people to live without work. Very, I think, important sentence in the Wealth of Nations. So then we have, as I said, wage going up, rents going up, profits going down. What does he do then in terms of the political economy, or actually political influence of these classes? That's what I wanted to make. Well, you see, my slides don't really go well with my talk, but the difference in the theory of moral sentiments and the Wealth of Nations, I did count how many times divinity and the derivatives of that are mentioned. Now you look here in the theory of moral sentiments, 149 times. In the Wealth of Nations, which is 3 times as long, God is mentioned 6 times. So it's an entirely different world that Adam Smith is describing. So let me continue. This was like a side. Let me continue, finish with Adam Smith. So what does he say there? The problem is that the employers have a very high influence on government policies. And they should be the last people to whom the government should speak, because their interests go against the social advancement. That's very interesting, because they are the only ones whose income is going to go down as development proceeds. But he says, like, why does it happen that actually they're most influential? Because he says they are actually very good in handling sophistry, and workers are uneducated and lazy, and landlords are indolent. So it is the class whose incomes in development would go down that would have the greatest influence on economic policy. And that's why, actually, as you know, there are some famous quotes that are actually quoted, you know, when he says that employers are the class who have often deceived the public and continue to deceive it, and they're the last one who should actually have the power over government policy. So that part that is quoted, but I want to say that it comes as a result of Adam Smith's view about what classes and what incomes are going in development to go up versus what classes and what incomes are going to go down. So that I will skip Ricardo, who is obviously very influential and on whose work essentially I think Marx builds. And for Marx, I would like to focus on two parts. One part is what happens to labor incomes, and the second part is what happens to the incomes of capitalists. These are, of course, very complicated matters that I would really have to summarize now. But my argument is when you come to labor, which means wages, that the common view that that people hold about Marx is that his dominant view was the immiseration, so-called, which means the decline in real wages. I think it's not defensible. It is defensible if you have, again, a very sort of intentional or focused or view where you pull out these quotes. And actually, quotes like that do exist. But they exist in the Communist Manifesto, what was written when Marx was 30 years of age, 29 to 30, and in a couple of paragraphs in Capital. But in the rest, the possibility of actually the likelihood of real wage increasing, I think, is as frequent and actually more frequent than the likelihood of real wage going down. So let me then do the logic of this. The logic of this is the following. Every category in Marx is historical. And for subsistence, as he says, or the minimum wage, he says that the minimum wage has two components. One is physiological, which you can sort of say is like the absolute poverty. And the other one is historical. So he acknowledges and he says two things. Over time, with the development, the historical component becomes more important, and consequently, the minimum wage, or if you will call it so-called quote-unquote subsistence, has to reflect that historical component and then rise with development. Secondly, he quotes in a number of cases, and actually there is a very nice, I don't know if I have it here or not, a quote on, a quote on the level of wages, where he puts the English wages at the top, then German, Austrian, Russian wages being lower. So there is a second part. First, over time, a wage in a given society goes up if there is development. And secondly, at a given point in time, countries differ by the amount of real wage in function of their development. Consequently, to believe that actually Marx held that the real wage over the long term, in a secular way, would not increase, I think is really inconsistent with what he wrote, and furthermore, inconsistent with his general view of historical change. So the only thing which would not historically change would have been the physiological subsistence. And that simply doesn't make sense, because Marx writes very clearly that our needs are historically determined. So the needs are not fixed. If you remember, there was also quite a famous quote that he says that the needs in a very primitive society are very limited, because you simply do not have a need for a cell phone if the cell phone is like 2,000 years ahead of you in terms of invention. It is simply that the needs are limited. And when society develops, the needs become greater. As the needs become greater, the minimum wage becomes higher. So that's for the wage part. And then I would move to very quickly to the capital part, where actually there is, of course, the famous tendency of the rate of profit to decline. And that here is the formula, but the formula essentially depends on two things. The denominator is the organic composition of capital, which is the ratio between constant and variable capital, which increases in development, which is not really surprising. Actually, everybody agrees. Neoclassical terms will see that K over L is going up in development, and actually it does go up with development. So the denominator goes up. The only thing which can stop the decline, secular decline, in the rate of profit is that the rate of surplus value, or other words, the ratio between the surplus value and the wage increases. So that basically workers work more. If they work 8 hours, instead of working 4 for themselves and 4 for the employer, they actually end up working 5 hours for the employer and 3 for themselves. There are some endogenous forces with the development which would cheapen the wage goods and might push that rate of surplus value up. But generally speaking, I think, and that was not a new argument, we can argue that the organic composition of capital has no upper bound, so it can increase to million to one or to billion to one, whereas the rate of surplus value has an upper bound. And if you have this view, then you have the secular decline of the rate of profit, as Marx was arguing, with, of course, offsetting forces. And I'll come now to the last two slides. In both cases of capital and labor, you then have the secular forces, which in the case of capital is the decline in the rate of profit. In the case of wages, secular increase of real wage with development, which are then offset by other forces that, again, Marx mentions. In the case of the rate of profit, the crisis offset it, and that's where the idea of creative destruction comes from. And that's actually a very clever idea, as you know, that what crises do, they reduce the value of capital. As they reduce the value of capital, the ratio between profit and the denominator, which is capital, goes up. So the profit rate is maintained. So that's actually a countervailing force to the law of the tendency of the profit rate to decline. Then expansion to the new markets. That's actually either geographically, or I think which makes more sense, it's actually to new activities. I will not go over that, but if you do expand to Airbnb and to Uber and to Lyft and to other things, you have created new goods, and the existence of these new goods and technological innovations would keep also the profit rate up. And the third one is interesting, is the concentration of capital. That comes from the fact that Marx argues that larger capitals have the advantage in reducing the unit cost of production. Consequently, they would always beat smaller capital, and small capitalists would actually basically lose out. And that would mean that there will be concentration of capital, and there would be obviously higher inequality due to that concentration of capital. But these are the offsetting forces. What are the offsetting forces on the labor side? The offsetting forces are the pressure of the reserve army of labor, of which I have not spoken so far, but that plays a very important role, obviously, in Marx. It's basically inclusion of people who have been not involved in the economy when the labor market becomes tight. It's what we call is also nomad population and others who are actually then sucked in, and consequently they keep a pressure on real wage. And this killing of labor, which is also an interesting idea, that was Marx's idea that the technological development essentially replaces labor, which is more skilled, and increases demand for low-skilled labor. And whether it is true or not, I think it's a complicated issue, but in his view, that was something which would also prevent real wage for going up. So the last slide is, what do you then have? You have 4 possible scenarios, and I would argue that Marx did not have a determinate theory of income distribution, whether because he could not form one, or whether he didn't have the time, or whether his books were edited by other authors. We can speculate, but basically there are 4 scenarios. The one which is a very optimistic scenario is of the secular rise in real wage and the secular decline in the rate of profit, which then leads to a secular decline in income inequality. The second, which is on the other extreme, the immiseration scenario, where you have, which is the common scenario still among some people today, who believe that Marx had it, immiseration of labor and much greater concentration of capital ownership in the hands of the few, which obviously implies higher inequality. The third scenario, which I think is very interesting, and the fourth, is when you combine these forces. So as you know, the third and the fourth come when you take one force from one side and the other force from the other side. So here you can have polarized society with an increase in real wage, but you have concentration of capital. So you then have really a more polarized society. And what happens to the income distribution there becomes more difficult to judge, because as you know, the Gini coefficient can go differently from the top 1% share. So in this case, with concentration and increase in real wage, you might actually have greater share of the top 1%, but not necessarily greater inequality measured by a synthetic measure of inequality. And finally, you can have a regressive society where you then have both the immiseration of labor and the decline in the rate of profit. Well, that's an interesting society because by definition, it needs also to mean, it means that the value, total value added has to go down. In which case, of course, this is a society who has a negative rate of growth, and that will become probably also more unequal society, although it's very hard to say because both capitalists lose and workers lose. So I think that I'll finish with that. I think that with Marx, you can make 4 different scenarios. I tend to privilege the first one, which is an optimistic scenario. I don't think that it is provable that it is really the view that he held, because he was at the same time a political activist. And there was also in some, ways that you can defend the other, especially I think polarization scenario, but I think it's more difficult to defend the immiseration view. And the reason why the immiseration view was and remains very common is that because in the early period before the World War I, which was really the peak of the Marxist sort of ideological discussion, it was a very comfortable scenario to believe for those who believe that the death of capitalism is imminent. So if you have that scenario plus the crisis, then you believe, well, this is very good. What we are doing means simply that capitalism is really at its last leg. Since it didn't happen, I think that scenario became very popular among right-wing people who then pull this out and say, look, Marx must have been wrong in everything because this didn't happen. And I think actually that is a very selective reading of Marx in that case. So I think I would stop here. I didn't go into the more present discussion. And obviously, as you can see, it is very sort of partial discussion of the book because the other people who are, Ricardo, for example, is extremely important. I didn't say a word about him. Pareto, likewise, and Kuznets, and the more recent period, and the epilogue as well about the future on income distribution studies, where I'm quite optimistic. But these are, of course, all there is simply not enough time because each of these authors can probably take the entire coursework, not only 25 or 30 minutes. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Branco. Muchas gracias por esta presentación. Como se dan cuenta, estamos en la etapa de venta del libro. Es un gran vendedor también, Branco. Yo ya tengo mi libro. Entonces, digamos, yo ya no tengo justificación para no leerlo. Le decía a Eva que está medio mandado a hacer para que hagas el curso sobre el libro, ¿no? En la escuela. Y yo también estoy en etapa de venta. Tengo que aprovechar, mencionar, que es algo que no dije al principio, que la presentación de Branco se da en el marco de un seminario permanente que organizamos distintas iniciativas, o sea, sobre México mismo, el SEI, el Departamento de Economía aquí, junto con el Equide, que está de cumpleaños con sus 20 años. Y la presentación de Branco no solamente está disponible aquí presencial, sino que está online. Y es la 6ª sesión que tenemos de nuestro seminario sobre desigualdades, movilidad social y equidad. Entonces esperemos que con esta calidad de presentadores, el número de personas que se conectan más o menos cada mes a nuestras presentaciones pues se vaya incrementando. Y de hecho estaba viendo aquí en los blogs que Ingrid Blaine hace un comentario sobre el libro, y a Ingrid la tuvimos, no me acuerdo si en la primera o en la segunda sesión del seminario, en la segunda sesión del seminario. Entonces, esa es de la calidad de presentadores que tenemos y los invitamos a todos a conectarse cada vez que lo tengamos. Y la otra cosa que quiero hacer antes de entrar al tema de las preguntas es agradecerle a Luis Ángel, que es uno de los coordinadores del seminario, por haber hecho posible la presencia de Branco aquí con nosotros. Entonces, Isidro, tú me dices cómo estamos de tiempo. Entonces, si les parece bien, vamos levantando la mano. Conozco a la gran mayoría, pero a lo mejor no, y no quiero cometer digamos, no ser cortes en ese sentido. Entonces, si me levantan la mano, les voy dando la palabra y si se pueden presentar por su nombre y ya hacer su pregunta o su comentario. Gracias. Empezamos por allá. Tú también vas, Isidro. Primero vamos a empezar por allá. Aquí, de este lado.
Thank you for the presentation, and it was really wonderful. I've learned a lot. My name is Werner Hernani. One question I got is, you're compounding technology and capital, and in this new era, many people are trying to decompose and said, okay, there are returns to technology and there are returns to capital, and there's kind of a new class who have access to technology world in the world, and another which are the old monies who have access to capital. So how would that fit within your framework?
No, that's okay. I would be brief in answering questions because I would like to have more questions, so not to be very long. Look, my objective in the book, as I said, was to study the authors as they wrote. I didn't want to do another Mark Bloch. I didn't want to look at them from today's perspective. I wanted to look for them from the perspective of the time when they wrote. And if we were to do it differently, it's like a different perspective, yes, then there are many issues. Like, obviously, technology doesn't play the role then that it plays today. An implicit view is technology plays a little bit more role in Marx because it's embodied. It's like embodied technological development in more capital. But, it doesn't play much of a role in Smith. So I think I totally understand. I think I understand your question, and it's a well-asked question. But I don't think that for them, technology, especially the separation between technology and capital per se, played the role that it plays for us.
Isidro. Tomamos la tuya, Isidro.
Sí, no, estaba pensando si uno no puede leer este cuadro como Piketty.
Sí, sí.
The breakdown scenario is
sí.
History, ¿no? Until the
sí.
Industrial Revolution. The optimist scenario is post-war war.
Yeah.
And now we are in a polarized society.
No, I actually think that this one is, yes, there are some similarities certainly with Piketty. I think there are similarities with Piketty. It's he derived it differently. He works from the neoclassical framework. He said he had never read the word of Marx before the Capital in the 21st century, which I think is true. But afterwards, he has read. Yes, there are similarities there. Actually, there are three things that I think Marx argued, and I think they're quite clear. The first is increase in real wage, which I think is somewhat debatable, which I said. The second is not debatable, decline in the labor share. I didn't talk about that, but the decline in labor share. And that's actually the same as Piketty, decline in labor share. And the third one is the tendency of the rate of profit to go down. So there are, I think, three things which you can also put in the neoclassical framework, and they fit there.
Por aquí. Adelante.
So a very well-established idea in political economy, to which I think you have contributed very much, is this idea of inequality between nations sort of like decreasing and inequality within nations increasing. But so like the different ways that all of these authors conceptualize inequality made me think maybe if we talk about inequality in terms of plain income, the same way that more modern economists think about, maybe we can say that, but could we say it is also maybe increasing if we sort of conceptualize inequality between countries in a more sort of like the French Revolution, where you have like class defined by what a country does in some way. Like there's countries that are basically resource extractors, and others that are like manufacturing countries, and then there's economies that are dedicated to basically services. Is that a way in which one could say maybe there is more inequality between countries than if we just look simply at incomes?
Okay, let me sort of disentangle your question, because you put too many things together. Let me disentangle that. The classical authors first work within nation state. They don't work within the world. And actually that's in my epilogue, it's a new development. They work within nation state. Within nation state, they work with units, which are classes. In terms of decomposition, that simply means that if I take a Gini coefficient, I take mean income of each class, de facto assume that each class has the same, that everybody within that class has the same mean income. If you have seen social tables, that's exactly what they do. They say landlords are 1.5% of the British population, and they have an average income of 3,000 pounds. And that's exactly the world that they have, more or less. And you can translate that into what would have been a Gini coefficient or inequality measure with that class structure. But the world is class world divided in discrete classes. With Pareto, as I said before, individuals come to the stage. What you introduce is yet another distinction, which of course they don't have, except if I had wanted to do that, I could actually introduce Marx in that last part, because Marx is the only one who, because of the development, he's writing that after Capital was published, he sees the problem of the world and globalization for the first time. That doesn't mean, of course, Ricardo writes about trade, but trade is not globalization. Smith writes about differences in income between the countries, including Mexico, by the way, which is mentioned there. Interesting, one small detail that I remember, not very good for the pre-Columbian civilizations, when he says there was not a single manufacturing good which was provided by the pre-Columbian civilization. And he has a view of the world, but only Marx, towards the end of his life, realizes the issue of globalization. And that's why I didn't go into that, but I think this is a new issue. It's a little bit like the question about technology. They didn't deal with that. But if I wanted, but it would really kind of deviate from the idea of the book, I think one could actually discuss more of Marx, his view on China, India, Russia, transition of socialism without going through capitalism. So really globalization starts playing a role there. And within country inequality, as you were saying, yes.
Por aquí, ¿alguien levantó la mano?
Yo tengo algunas preguntas, pero más hasta Branco, el autor, que el libro, digamos, ¿no?
Adelante. Ahora
Cuando escribiste el libro, ¿qué pensabas cuando escribiste el libro? ¿Este libro era para ti o era un libro que pensabas que iba a ser útil en una clase de historia del
No, es un libro para mí. And actually, I wanted to say in the beginning, but I didn't. I wanted to take, if you have seen, some of you might have seen the German movie, which was The Life of Others. The very last scene is actually when the author goes and buys the book, and they say, okay, should I wrap the book because is it like a Christmas present? No, he said, it's a book for myself. So basically, I wrote it for myself, and I wrote it mostly during COVID. And it was fun to write it. You know, I, as I said, maybe before we talked, one omission, and I mentioned it in the book, is the structuralists. I think the number 7 should have been a structuralist author, but I didn't know enough about them. I know Celso Furtado, and actually I knew Samir Amin, and I thought of him being as number 7, but as the further I then read his more recent work, I thought that basically his best work was done when he was very young, and then afterwards he didn't. So I don't think he has evolved very much, and consequently I thought if I have a chapter on him, it would be a very short chapter, and I didn't.
¿Y cómo cambió o cuál es tu mirada sobre la desigualdad ahora? ¿Cuál es tu explicación de la desigualdad?
What is the implication for the?
Sorry?
I'm sorry, what is it?
No implication. Your understanding of what is inequality now? What are the causes of inequality? The inequality that we are living now.
Well, I don't think that I changed my views after the book. You know, the book is I think how should I say, one thing that I've seen, and I think it's important for us to realize, is that our view, first of all, that we have when we study inequality, if we want really to make it as it is, a political issue, we have to have a certain, what I said, narrative of society. We have to have a theory, and we have to have the empirics. The problem with the 70s to 90s was that the empirics were very strong. Theory was really fanciful because, as I was saying, it was a theory which basically disregarded any power and political differences between people, and there was not much of a narrative. So that was what I actually take from the book, is that if we want to make income inequality or income distribution studies salient, we have to acknowledge the political dimension, but that political dimension changes with evolution. As I said in the beginning, for Keynes, it was legal groups. For the 3 classical authors, it was classes in relation, defined as relation to the means of production. For Pareto, elite versus the rest. For Kuznets, as I said before, agriculture versus manufacturing. But nowadays, it could be the issues like racial discrimination, gender discrimination, and I think class discrimination, class differences. But we cannot, if we want to make income distribution studies relevant, we cannot ignore the dividers between people, the dividers which have political connotation. So for me, this is the biggest lesson of the book, is that you change the view of what is the marker depending on the society that you live. If I had here, for example, somebody from the US South or Brazil during slavery or Rome, I think the main marker is slavery, but it was not a relevant marker for Marx or Ricardo or for us. So it's really, I think, that historical evolution where you have to look at income inequality as always a political issue with markers being defined by the level of development or the feature of that society.
De hecho, aquí va Luis. ¿Tú tienes levantada la mano, Araceli? Perfecto. Luis.
Just following on this last subject that you mentioned. When you put together all the authors that you studied, you see a change, for example, in how capital is actually defined. So capital for the classics is something, and capital income is derived from the ownership of means of production. But then we go to Piketty, and capital is wealth. And yes, capital incomes then are not necessarily attached to the production sphere in classical terms. So I was wondering, how do you see that evolution in how we understand one of the key drivers of the economy, capital, in how do we understand the distributive dynamics? Because, for example, that's one of the key discussions or the key points where neo-Ricardians, post-Keynesians always criticize the neoclassicals and Piketty's theoretical explanation of R larger than G. in the sense that, well, what is the capital that you are defining?
I want to say for in the case of Piketty that the result, the issue was the difference between K and W. And W, for people like me working on income distribution and Piketty also, we always use W because W is whatever it could be, painting, it could be whatever is definition of marketable, as Ed Wolf also says, is the definition of whatever is marketable wealth assets that you can sell. Whether they're productive assets or not, doesn't matter. What the problem arises when you actually get to translate that into a production function, neoclassical production function, because clearly jewelry and paintings are not in the production function. So there is this fundamental issue, the difference between productive capital, which is in neoclassical terms K, or in Marx's case, it's really C. It's actually capital as machinery plus the materials that are used, and wealth. So I think it's unbridgeable. There is a productive wealth, there is unproductive wealth. I think it's actually by definition like that. But one thing that I also wanted to mention in the answer to expand that partly on your question, but also on the previous one, there is an important part in chapter 7 about income distribution studies under socialism, which also I would urge people to read, because there the problem is the following. If you eliminate private ownership of capital, you have de facto truly eliminated capitalists as a class. So you cannot really study society with these classes which no longer exist. And the claim was, we have a classless society. And in some sense, it was true, that claim. On the other hand, new markers appeared. And actually that society is interesting because markers were essentially different power in the government or state hierarchy. So the marker is yet entirely different. It's no longer necessarily gender or race or the access to privately owned capital, but access to the power of the state. And that's why actually I discussed why the income distribution studies under socialism were very few. One reason you can say, okay, because they didn't want to release the data. That's one reason. But there is a fundamental ideological reason that actually the definition of classes was entirely different, and it's new. So that was, I think that society is also very interesting because again, as you kind of go historically, you see that the salient features which define classes change in function of the structure of that society.
Pedro.
Hi, first of all, thank you for the presentation. It's been a pleasure to hear you talk about the book, so that's great. And I want to ask something that goes hand in hand with all of what you've been saying. And as you said, the definition of class changes from generation to generation, right? And another important part of inequality is the intergenerational transmission of these inequalities, right? And how do these different class structures actually translate into more or less inequalities for the next generations when we do change the definition of classes in each generation?
I'll have to sit down. Yeah, well, you know, I didn't deal with that. It's actually, it's yet a different issue. You know, if we had more data and if we could actually study the intergenerational transmission of inequality in the societies of the 19th century, I think we would be able, and there are some attempts, I think, to study that recently. We would be able to say more about that, but it is not an issue that I actually could deal with. And as you know, in terms of empirical information, actually, probably Miles Korak spoke about that when he was here last time, but it is something new. You know, we didn't have intergenerational or longitudinal studies for a long time. So it's empirically a different issue.
Había una por acá, Isidro. Aquí está. Tip.
Okay, thank you for the presentation. You talk a lot about elites and the poor. Can you say something about middle class, its evolution, or something general, please?
Not really. I mean, the middle class, if you want to define the middle class, first, the definition, obviously, the middle class is so complex. But if you define the middle class as the class with, if there are three classes, the middle class is capitalist. In Ricardo, the middle class is capitalist. So, you know, there is no, I really don't think that we can, when we speak of classical authors, that we can speak of the middle class. Well, there just ain't middle class.
Rosa María.
Dos. This is affirmative action.
Yes. Yeah.
Muchas gracias. Lo voy a preguntar en español. Una primera pregunta, tratando de entrar al tema de desigualdad fuera de la economía, más bien con una mirada social. Comencé a revisar alguna bibliografía hace muchos años y encontré un libro que en ese entonces acababa de salir de Sundrum. Y
Sí, Agnos Sundrum.
exacto. Y me llamó la atención que en las primeras páginas lo que decía es que no hay una teoría sobre la desigualdad. Entonces, mi primera pregunta sería si usted cree que la hay. Y la segunda, y siento admitirlo, pero no entiendo esa clasificación. ¿Cada cuadro es escenario o es un tipo de sociedad? Porque los dos de arriba, los dos de arriba se llaman escenarios y abajo es una sociedad y acá también es una sociedad. Y por cierto, si tendría usted algún ejemplo de una sociedad regresiva, porque en todos los otros hay un ejemplo, pero en ese no. Gracias.
On the first question, I would agree, actually, and actually, I know what book you're referring to. It was first a very long paper about, it starts with Ricardo's, I think, the most important, the motto of the principles. I would say no, there is no theory, and I think there cannot be a theory because, and precisely if you look at my book, there cannot be a theory because societies are different. So the theory of the pre-revolutionary French society cannot be the theory of the United States today. You know, it's just a different society. We cannot even have a theory of a capitalist society because China, as you might know, my previous book, Capitalism Alone, is the capitalist society by all standard Marxist markers. But it has different rules. So I think that really there is no single theory. But on the second question, you made a very good point. I haven't noticed that it was one is society and other is scenarios. Maybe I was first impressed because I really didn't, I had to very much deny that the breakdown scenario is the only scenario. But indeed, they're actually, let me see, is the breakdown scenario of a society? I'm not sure. So I have to think about this. It's actually, but it's a very good point. Now, for the last regressive, I intentionally didn't want to put any like country there. You know, you can say Argentina could be there. But it's not, you have to have a decline in GDP per capita on a secular basis in order to have something like that. Yeah.
¿Otra pregunta?
Sí, ¿cómo ves?
El dueño del micrófono.
No veo a nadie levantar la mano, con gusto.
Adelante.
Con gusto. ¿Cómo ves la desigualdad en los próximos 30 años? ¿Tenés la visión de Piketty, de que va a ser increasing polarization y la economía política va a estar dominada por ese 0,001%?
In the last, the epilogue, I actually am very optimistic about income distribution studies. First of all, I think that our scope has expanded tremendously with globalization. The question which was asked before, because really we now can study inequality in the world as a single unit. And it does have many implications, including, and you were talking about intergenerational transmission, including the fact that inequality of opportunity is largely determined by where you were born, because the gaps between nations, although they are decreasing because of China essentially, are still enormous. So it's an entirely new area of studies. Then I think that we have actually Piketty's work, which I think is very important. And we also have social tables, which now we create for the past societies, which now enable us to study inequality in the 19th and 18th and 17th centuries. And even there was a recent paper by Guido Alfani about the Aztec Empire, for example. So these are really major developments. So I'm in that sense very optimistic, and we have much more data. And since inequality is by definition heterogeneous stuff, because it's very only inequality because your income is not the same as mine, and we have information about that, it's actually being done now with much more data-intensive empirical work. But when you ask me about like what do I expect developments, let's suppose in the rich world in the next 30 years, it's a very difficult question, you know. The facts are complex. You know, we now have in the UK decline in the inequality. Like over the last 15 years, there was a same level, and then most recent. Some of that was due to COVID. US actually, if you want to make people upset, you can tell them that the largest decline in US inequality in the last 50 years happened under the last year of Trump administration. They would not believe you, but it's true because of the large government transfers linked with COVID. Okay, this is like a discrete stuff. I think it's difficult, and especially difficult, and I will talk more about it in a different occasion, when you look at the current situation where you have de facto trade war between the US and China, which would affect growth rates and distributions in the two countries, war in Ukraine, and now the war in the Middle East, and COVID. So how do we can project what will happen to inequality in the US? I really honestly don't see. We can, for the secular forces globally, yes, we can say that China's role is no longer crucial because it has become sufficiently rich country, and the whole thing globally depends now much more on Africa and India. But this is secular. But what will happen in the next 3 or 4 years, I don't think anybody has any idea.
Por aquí hay otro. Ahora sí vas tú, Araceli. Y por aquí luego tenemos una pregunta.
Sorry, I didn't want to ask because I didn't check the book. So I don't know whether that's in the book is a question.
No, nobody has read the book.
No? Okay. So in the winter school of Keynote, of this network of inequality, many of the researchers are trying to find not the macro inequality, but why the micro inequalities exist. And there are many experiments on why societies care about inequality. And in these experiments, when you play, if you get some income, and would you give something for other people to be better or to be equal to you, you can see that in Scandinavian societies, people care and people give. And it's more equality in these societies, and in the United States or more capitalist is like the American dream. You get what you work for it. So people don't care. I work for it. I deserve it. I don't care about you. So I don't know if in your book you have descriptions for caring inequality in the society.
No, the quick answer is no. That's not at all in the book. And certainly there were no empirical studies of that nature with Ricardo or Marx. Yeah. But that's another methodological issue, is whether, and I don't want to go into that, I have not worked on that, but they have a very, how should I say, skeptical view on these studies. I believe when you can study, when you actually observe certain behavioral patterns, but not in games. Maybe I got this impression partly from my son, who participated in one of these. I think, was it Heckman or somebody, who was that, who organized these summer schools, and my son went there. It was near LA. The kids play these games, and what people don't realize, there is a game within a game. So there was a rich kid who intentionally lost money because he didn't care about money and he wanted others to lose. And that becomes an input in your behavior. They actually saw this game as a game between them. And many of them actually didn't want to maximize money. So, and you know, the Nordic countries have this reputation, which is partly justified, but partly exaggerated. Sweden, for example, is a country which always had very high wealth inequality. It's a country which is probably with the US and UK over the 40 years period, last 40, with the largest increase in the Gini coefficient. It's a country which now has totally banned immigration, practically. As you know now, actually people who had a residence permit in Sweden are now being sent back. So we have this sort of little bit idealized picture of the Nordic countries that everybody shares, but they do share, but it could be argued that they share because they are culturally the same, but maybe they don't want to share with others. Right?
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting. My question is, what could be the role of the society and the access of this society to information and knowledge of inequality, and staying in one or other scenario in historical terms, but also in these days? What is the role of the access to information to the people in reducing inequality?
I don't know, it's a difficult question. Obviously, if there is more, well, I would not be here today if suddenly 15 years ago, inequality did not suddenly acquire a huge importance. I think that before that, inequality really didn't play much of a role, certainly in the US. I remember when I was first time publishing that actually there was no such, in the journal Economic Literature, you did not have the entry for income inequality. It's like what they say for the Chinese, you had to combine two words, you know, welfare and distribution, or something like that. There was no term. And that shows you, as I was saying in the beginning of the presentation, shows you that political dislike in the American discourse about inequality. I don't think it was by accident the journal Economic Literature did not have that term. It was political. And then politics changed. What are the reasons for that? It's a different discussion. And that became a very common word and everybody is talking. So obviously, without acknowledging that and accepting that, we cannot change things. But obviously, knowledge is important in that respect, but it's not sufficient. Political decisions, I think, are quite important.
Luis?
To this framework, something that I was thinking just hearing you in the presentation of the different determinants of each state is, well, perhaps a regressive society adjusts to, and now I would like to put in the framework that not your previous, but the previous book, The Global Inequality, that the regressive society is kind of a political Kuznets, in the sense that you could characterize that as, for example, Latin America in the 80s, or Greece after the debt crisis in the 2000s. And what is, so in the sense that you don't get the technology prediction that many people said that you could derive that scenario from Marx. But certainly you can get that the political forces that shape the distribution, as you said, the political determinants of a Kuznets wave, can throw you into a regressive society. So I would like
into the last one.
Yeah.
Yes, I really think that I think the usefulness of this quadros is that they make us think first that a Marxist approach was not, as a commentator to my book rightly said, sort of narrow Victorian deterministic. I think it was probabilistic. I think it was probabilistic not because necessarily Marx thought as those terms. I think because he just was not, the theory was not completed. And I believe that actually, if we take this and try to figure out what are the forces which led to one society or the other society, and how you might move, as you said, actually from one society to another, or from one scenario to another, I think it has a certain wealth of helping us reflect on this. As you said about Greece, for example, you can also say that, well, that's a difficult one. You know, this regressive society, to some extent, were also the transition societies to capitalism. They had a decline, like Russian decline in value added was greater than the US decline during the Great Depression. But then they had a huge concentration of profits and immiseration of labor. So I think playing these things would actually enrich our perception, but I have not done that sufficiently, I have to say.
Rafael.
Sí, muchas gracias por la presentación y el libro. Creo que todos estaremos muy emocionados para leerlo pronto. Mencionó en un momento que la distribución del ingreso siempre pues, va a ser un tema, un fenómeno político ante todo, y que depende de cada sociedad y cada momento histórico en el que nos paremos. En ese sentido, mi pregunta es si en el epílogo del libro o en estas consideraciones más contemporáneas se toma en cuenta el papel de bueno, una creciente literatura que hace más referencia al crecimiento del sector financiero y el crecimiento de la influencia que está teniendo este sector de manera contemporánea en los principales problemas que estamos teniendo, ¿no? En ese sentido, no podríamos entender nuestra sociedad si no consideramos el alcance y la complejidad que este sector está teniendo en nuestra vida, y si estamos sometidos cada vez a más crisis o problemas relacionadas justamente al crecimiento desproporcionado de este gran fenómeno, ¿no? Entonces, nada más para saberlo. Gracias.
Yeah, I mean, that's beyond the confines of the book, you know, and even my own thinking. The financialization is really, the size of financialization is really a new phenomenon. As you know, some of these activities were not even included in the definition of the GDP before. There, I think, many issues there. One is not, well, I think it goes back to the really what we define as the activities that augment the welfare. And I think that there are many, one can argue that there are many activities, Mariana Mazzucato did it in part, that there are many activities where are what, I don't like this term because it comes from Ann Kruger, but they are directly unproductive activities. But I think there are actually all activities, like if you look around, you see a huge employment of labor in securities, securitization. Technically, it's really unproductive. It's prevention from, I mean, if you didn't have thieves and stealing, that activity would not exist. You know, so it's actually preventing something. It's not directly adding to anything. So, you know, there are many activities like that, and I think financial sector can also be argued. It's not to me obvious that it is really adding. It adds something, but whether it is adding like 10% of GDP, I really don't know.
¿Alguna otra pregunta? Por favor.
So if I may, I want to follow up a little bit on my previous question, and just sort of like moving beyond what these specific authors say to sort of like a more general view of globalization and all this. I guess my lingering doubt about this is, could we characterize, or would it be like a useful framework to think about globalization sort of like a move from sort of like the income inequality between countries in the past to a more equal distribution of income, but at the same time, sort of like a increase in the inequality in the status between countries. So like,
I mean, this is my different presentation. Of course, I've done that presentation multiple times. So I even have a slides here, but we're not going to show. You know, global inequality went you start 1820 because that's where we have Madison's data. And then Bourguignon and Morisson did the work. So it goes like this throughout 19th century. And it's pushed by two forces, by part of the world becoming rich, India and China stagnating, going down. It's very simple. And within national inequalities go up. So both forces push global inequality from 1820 to a peak around World War I, and then it stays in the second period. This would really be when I was born, we actually thought, I thought actually wrongly, that the three worlds were defined somehow forever. But of course, the three worlds were actually defined then, because there was a first world, second world, and the third world, very high global inequality, but without further increases. Gini over about 70 global. And then with China and Asia, you have the decline in global inequality. But now the two forces work against each other. Between country inequality, because Asia starts as being poor and becomes richer. Between inequality is getting squeezed because there are lots of people. These are between inequality population weighted. That's important to underline, because if Chad goes richer, doesn't matter for the world. But if China gets richer, it matters. And then within inequalities went up. So the two forces work against each other. Obviously in China, China's GDP, Gini was 28, is now 47. But China in the meantime increased, I think, GDP per capita by, I don't know, 8 times or something. So now we have that situation. But we may be now at the end of that, what they call the third era, because China is no longer an automatic reducer since it has become rich. And now we depend on Africa, which has a dismal feature in terms of economic growth for now 70 years. And for Africa to move from per capita growth rate of 1.5 to 6, nobody can see this happen. So if it doesn't happen, then we would have another increase in global inequality. And you know what, last point, politically, and I want to emphasize that, and I actually do that in my recent papers, it's a political thing. When you had this 19th century increase in inequality, what did happen? Countries that were powerful, economically, militarily, and technologically conquered the world. So, you know, when you have this increase in inequality, it's not like nothing happens, just somebody gets rich, somebody is poor. It really has political implication, even at the global level. So what will be political implication of another increase in inequality? I don't know, I really don't know, but I just think that we might have come to the end of that third era, which was driven by Asian growth.
Thank you for the presentation and a very interesting topic. My question relates to the fact that we have been thinking about or talking about the sources of inequality and how they have evolved over time. It would be interesting to know about how these authors or how we evolved about thinking about what we can do to prevent inequality. Yeah. Like what are the policies that different, how is the history of thought about the policies that different authors propose to prevent inequality or to decline inequality? And in particular, I'm interested in the role of education, because that's the first thing I used to think about when thinking about what we need to decline inequality, equality of opportunity, provide good quality education. But somehow I think that started later on than these authors, probably because of the middle class argument that there was no middle class. But also, I would like to know how you think about the role of education in the later years. Because I feel like at some point it was thought as the silver bullet, and suddenly it is not as important as it used to be in the past. Like taxation, for example, become a more prevalent, much more prevalent.
Let me answer the first part of the question because it's quite interesting, and I didn't forgot to mention that. First of all, my book explicitly doesn't take normative point of view. It's really, as I've explained before, it's question like what are the forces determining income distribution and how will they evolve? There is no normative. If I had normative stuff, I would have included, for example, Rousseau, who is not mentioned in the book. Rawls, not mentioned at all. So it's no normative. It also happened by pure coincidence. There are two authors, and I got in touch with them after they finished the books, and they finished the books about the same time as I. Daryl McMahon, who is a professor of history, and he wrote a book titled Equality, just published. And he reviews normative use of equality from the Christian writers, and actually even probably from the Old Testament onwards, and then goes through Plato, Aristotle, includes then, of course, Smith and Marx, Rawls, and most recent, I would actually really think it's an excellent book, most recent part about identity politics, racial. I think the last two chapters are brilliant. And then another author, David Leigh Williams, who is also writing now about political perception of inequality, really pure coincidence. And he also uses more or less the same people well, not, I mean, other than Smith and Marx, he's also using Rousseau, Montesquieu, and so forth. Going back to your question and answering it indirectly, there is also a place for somebody who will do policy. You know, I have not done that in the book, but it would be interesting to have a historical overview, because then you would have Malthus for sure. You would have, of course, Ricardo is to a large extent determined by policy, but you would have many other people who had, actually Tocqueville, it is not well known, but Tocqueville wrote a small booklet which was never published during his life. It's called Memoir on the Pauperism. And he went to England exactly to look at policy, because there was this question, how come that we want to copy England, liberal democracy, and, you know, not a full franchise, but large franchise, more developed country. But the poverty in England is much deeper than in France. Because, of course, as we know, you know, people were chased away from land. The French had always, after the revolution, smallholders who at least were not, you know, famished. So it's an interesting book because he looks at policies and in the poor laws. And so I think there are like lots of room for a book like that, but my book is not one.
¿Más preguntas?
I think it's really interesting that we had these two other books that it's really not publicity for them, but really brilliant books on similar authors, but really from a very different perspective.
Bueno, me toca a mí, ¿no? Digo, yo tengo una ventaja porque yo tengo aquí el libro. Y entonces vi el primer párrafo del prólogo y vi el último párrafo del epílogo. Y por ahí alguien preguntaba de la perspectiva y tal, y también tiene que ver con la perspectiva en términos analíticos, ¿no? Es decir, hacia dónde vamos. Y tú en el último párrafo haces referencia a esta nueva élite global, ¿no?
Ajá, sí, sí.
Y entonces sugieres que eso no necesariamente puede tener un efecto político en términos de la desigualdad entre países y al interior de los países. Y a partir de ahí planteas la necesidad de que las ciencias sociales se replanteen o establezcan nuevas preguntas, ¿no? Nada más que ya no nos dices cuáles preguntas son esas, ¿no? Y mi pregunta va en ese sentido, es decir, tú en ese sentido, ¿qué tipo de preguntas te estás imaginando que tendríamos que empezar a pensar algún tipo de respuesta?
Well, as you said, actually, at the end, I mentioned the global elite, you know, there is a formation of a global elite, although with now sort of de-globalization to some extent beginning, one can wonder how that global elite would sort of continue to be created, because they might have similar incomes, but they may not interact as much as we thought that they would. But even when they were interacting, what was interesting, there was no political basis for them. In other words, when you have an elite within a country, that elite controls the political process and there is a nation state, so there is a policy. But when you have a global elite, how does this global elite control things? And this is really for you, much more for younger people to wonder, you know, to what an extent now with new technologies, people like Musk, for example, or Bezos, or Jack Ma, or whoever, are they able to influence the political process? And it's not, I don't know, really. I don't know. Maybe the politics are just too strong and they will not be able to do it, but maybe they would. So I think it is really, we are on a threshold of a new world. I actually speak, for example, I was speaking for a while wrongly about global middle class, but then realized the term doesn't make sense. I started using global median class because global middle class includes people who really don't have the middle class income that the West believes is the middle class, because they're much poorer. And so what is the global middle class? They're people who are in the middle, but they are not what the West believes is the middle class because, their incomes are much too low. So yes, I think we are at the threshold of a new world. I'm not quite sure it will be a better world, but we are there.
Muchísimas gracias, Branco Milanovic, por esta fantástica presentación y por tu disposición para atender toda la variedad de preguntas que hubo y mostrarnos la profundidad de conocimiento que tienes sobre esta problemática que nos interesa a todos los que estamos aquí en la sala.
Muchas gracias a ustedes. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias. Démosle un aplauso a Branco, por favor. Y antes de irnos, hago mi último anuncio. En el marco del seminario permanente, no es el último del año, el que tenemos con Branco, sino que todavía tenemos uno más en noviembre, el 13 de noviembre, de manera probablemente virtual. Va a estar con nosotros Santiago Levy, entonces los invitamos a que se conecten ese día. Muchísimas gracias.
A ustedes.